Hello, class. I'm starting up the lecture again, covering the articles by Lee, and I forgot who the other author is on stereotype threat. Burgess et al. Um, so this first article by Lee focused on health literacy and cultural competency, and how these two should be taught together at the same time to all healthcare providers and health service providers. Um, a few years back, I participated in a training, probably about 6 years ago, that was titled Cultural Competency Training. And huge part of it was really understanding the health literacy of the populations we work with and how important this was in health services and within healthcare itself. So let's go on to the slide. So basically, they address or suggest that both health literacy and cultural differences between patients and providers are actual determinants of healthcare disparities. And this article really highlights the importance of training medical providers in both, and providing a conceptual framework that is inclusive of training on low health literacy and how to overcome it, and also how to function in a culturally competent manner. So literacy has multiple components, including oral literacy, so our ability to listen and capture information, as well as to speak and communicate in the same way that our providers are doing. The print literacy is also important. If a person cannot read or write, that is a huge barrier to them engaging successfully in healthcare information and accessing healthcare information. Numeracy is another component, as we discussed earlier in our other lecture, and it really focuses on the ability to understand and work with numbers. And then, of course, there's the cultural and conceptual knowledge that we come with, our understanding of the world, our worldview, right, that is shaped by our cultural environment. And so all of these things might be considered outside of the health field, but within the health field, they contribute to health literacy. And so basically this article defined health literacy on behalf of the patient, and also health literacy on behalf of the medical organization providing services. And so regarding personal health literacy, this refers to the degree to which individuals have the ability to, one, to find, two, if they find it and read it, to understand it, and then to apply it or use that information and services to inform their health-related decisions, okay, that they can take for themselves or for others, loved ones, for example. Organizational health literacy refers to the degree to which organizations equitably enable individuals to find, understand, and use the information and services to help inform their patients' health-related decisions. Okay, so one is the individual health literate, and is the organization set up in a way to provide information that facilitates health literacy for the people it serves, right? And so research suggests that about 36% of U.S. adults have low health literacy. So that's a very large portion of our population, about a third, who might have trouble understanding, comprehending, or even executing medical instructions or directions. And so we know also from the literature or from the research that low health literacy impacts racial ethnic minorities more so. Um, Also, it disproportionately affects people of low socioeconomic status and Medicaid populations. Um, it results in, therefore, in low access to health care and access to quality health care as well. And then also people who have low health literacy are more likely to use healthcare or to need healthcare and to experience the high costs of healthcare. Okay, so healthcare access and quality are one of the big social determinants of health domains highlighted in Healthy People 2030. So Healthy People 2030 establishes the goals for the next decade as to where we want to be. So it kind of sets goals and objectives for how we want to be uh, eliminating health disparities and functioning at an optimal capacity. And so Healthy People 2030 suggests that increasing the health literacy of our U.S. population is a very high priority. Um, Yet they also acknowledge that there's not a lot of research on health literacy or how on interventions that help promote health literacy. So there's really not a lot of evidence-based interventions or EBIs as I list here on the slide to address health literacy. So they are recommending that this needs to be an area where research dollars are dedicated to encourage researchers to examine and to develop and explore different types of interventions with different populations to make sure that we're developing a pool of evidence-based interventions. I'm trying very carefully not to turn off the recording because I've done it a couple of times. So if you see me pausing or such between slides, it's just I'm trying to be careful and see where my cursor is so I don't hit the off button. Okay, so what can healthcare providers do? Well, they can promote a shared understanding between the patient and the provider. They can help increase awareness and sensitivity to cultural differences of the patient population. One thing that's really important is for them to recognize their own assumptions about other racial ethnic groups and also closely examine their biases, honestly examine their biases, and learn to take those and recognize them and put them aside when they're interacting with their patients and help to overcome them, to become more educated to overcome those biases. They can help by employing appropriate communication skills, and they can use team resources to diagnose and address low health literacy and cultural differences. So there's lots of tools online to help providers how to recognize when an individual has low health literacy. And also there's lots of trainings for cultural sensitivity. Although our president was suggesting that that was not necessary and was actually discouraging cultural competency training. So another reason to go vote today. If you haven't already done so, I hope you did get to go vote. Okay. So both health literacy and promoting health literacy and also engaging in culturally competent manners, both of those have very similar pedagogies or teaching strategies that can help address health literacy, okay, and cultural incongruencies between the provider and patient. And so you might have heard of the LEARN model, which requires listening first to the patient, listening to how they are conceiving their illness, explaining carefully to them what you are seeing as a provider or as a either a medical provider or even as a service provider, acknowledging any concerns they might have or any cultural barriers that they might be experiencing, reviewing what is required, and negotiating, how they will proceed with the recommendations being provided. The teach back technique, which we saw in the other lecture, is really, really important and is also relevant to health literacy and also to cultural competency. And so making sure that when one provides instruction, that they try to make sure that the individual understands in the most culturally sensitive way in order to ensure that the patient doesn't feel in any way threatened or made to feel dumb, like they don't know, that like they're not smart enough to understand what's being told to them. So really it's presented in a way so that you're asking them to present back the information to make sure that you, as a service provider, did a good job in explaining to begin with, right? And then we've talked, well, I think you've experienced or come across motivational interviewing, which is its own technique, but it really takes a patient-centered approach to identifying the situation and to helping find solutions that will benefit the individual's health. Let's see. So these are really, really important strategies, and if we don't learn to address health literacy and be aware of cultural incongruencies and make sure we're being culturally sensitive to our patients or to the people that we work with, this can result in lots of problems in terms of disengagement by the populations we serve. So they might either not adhere to the medical recommendations. They might even withdraw altogether from engaging in services or healthcare. Just overall poor adherence and reductions in follow-ups if that's required. So these are really important strategies that we need to be engaging in and making sure that all our healthcare providers, all our health service providers are engaging in. Okay, I almost did it again. I almost turned off the camera. Okay, so again, the patient-centered outcomes are really important here, and we need to, in order to, really be focusing if our cultural competency training or our health literacy assessments and efforts to address health literacy, low health literacy is effective, we need to be engaging in research. And again, as Healthy People 2030 identified already, it's like there's not enough research in this area. We need to dedicate a lot more resources and attention to this area because we need to be able to really engage in rigorous research and, well, first rigorous design of interventions and then their evaluation to make sure that they are of good efficacy with the populations we're trying to serve. And so we need to be assessing if the training is having positive effects on patient satisfaction, right? So if you're a satisfied patient or a recipient of services, you're more likely to return, right, or to adhere with the recommendations. Is it another type of assessment that one might engage in the quality of life of the patient? Are they improved? Has their quality of life improved as a result of this enhanced effort to address low health literacy and cultural competency? Are they adhering to their therapies and are they demonstrating good clinical indices? And so this is what they mean by providing, good, solid, rigorous, and standardized measures of outcomes from interventions that attempt to address low health literacy and to promote cultural competency among providers. And so only in this manner are we going to be able to identify whether our efforts are actually leading to health equity, right, or to a reduction in health disparities. So they identified 4 phases of health disparities research. The first being to identify the nature and extent of disparities, and then to try to identify the underlying factors of those disparities, making sure that we're focusing on culture and health disparity and health literacy when we're working with racial, ethnic, and populations of low socioeconomic status. And then we need to develop, right? We need to develop interventions that are engaging, that are relevant to the populations we serve, and implement those, but then also evaluate them, right, with a bunch of different approaches. They talked about the mixed methods approach, which involves both qualitative research and quantitative research. Okay, so qualitative research might actually engage people in the study and ask them their personal opinion about what their experience was like, and if they liked the intervention, if they felt they benefited from the intervention or not. And then, of course, we can do standardized survey assessments or self-report assessments as well. But those tools have to be reliable, and they have to be valid. Okay, they can't just be some random questions somebody made up here or there. There's a whole bunch of steps to make sure that tools are reliable and valid. Okay. All right, so the next article was on stereotype threat and health disparities. So this article was really capturing how stereotype threat can really lead into the whole cascade of stress responses that we talked about last week, right? It's like it should have sounded very familiar when they were saying, well, when somebody experiences a stereotype threat, they have cognitive dysfunction. They have very strong emotional responses, right? They have physiological arousal, and it causes them to perform worse. It causes them to do all sorts of things, right? So all of those types of responses should have been clicking in your head as like, hey, these are all the stress responses we talked about in last week's lecture, right? And so what do medical educators and future physicians need to know about stereotype threat and how this type of threat contributes to health disparities? So let's start with the definition of stereotype threat. And so basically this is a response or reaction to cues in one's environment that make stereotyped cues in the environment that make negative stereotypes associated with one's group status salient, okay? So if I go into an environment that has cues in it that suggest that I am lesser of a person somehow, that's going to pose a threat to me, okay? So this can, again, result in multidimensional stress responses, including, as we said, diminished cognition, diminished working memory, increased negative affects, like maybe lots of anxiety, physiological arousal, like increased heart rate, blood pressure, sweaty palms, reduced motivation, right? If something's making us feel something's making us feel bad, we're less likely to want to engage. We're more likely to want to distance ourselves from that type of situation. So we might be reduced in our motivation to perform well according to the recommendations, to exert any effort, and even to maintain self-control. Okay, so they've done lots of studies with lots of different populations where they manipulated the stereotype threat. And so whether it be a patient, whether it be a student, whether it be a person with mental health problems, the minute that stereotype threat is activated, it can result in all of these type of responses that we have listed here on this slide, right? And they'll result in overall poor performance and negative behavioral consequences. So we want to avoid this stereotype threat to all extent possible. And so here's just the figure that they posted in the article, and just showing how the sources of stereotype threat can lead to all these, they call them internal mechanisms, but really it's all stress response. And then the consequences of that response of the individual, right? Impaired performance, discounting the importance of or the validity of the feedback one is getting in the encounter. And so if you're discounting the feedback being provided by your doctor, that is not a good thing, right? So stereotype threat can lead to that, to disengagement, right? It's like, I'm not coming back. I don't ever want to feel this way again. I'm going to avoid that situation. Disidentification with the recommendations. So it's like, those are recommendations for someone that is not like me, right? I don't identify with those behaviors that are not like me. And the article talked about, those behaviors are white. Healthy lifestyle practices are white, and I'm not white, and so I don't engage in that behavior, right? I engage in this behavior that is like me, that represents people like me. It can also seriously affect one's professional aspirations, right? So stereotype threat can play a role in various realms, from healthcare all the way to one's educational motivations. So here's disidentification is defined. Sorry. This was meant to be like some of the consequences of stereotype threat, and I'll fix the title here in the slide. But disidentification, again, minorities define their group's identities in ways that distinguish it from the majority group. So they no longer view the domain, such as education, as central to their identity. That's part of the majority group's domain, not part of my domain. And so they might start expending effort in the domain, for example, in education, or, for example, medical adherence or healthy lifestyle, or whatever the case, whatever the domain that the person is functioning with, and made to feel that is not, that were they made to where they were experiencing the stereotype threat. As such, it can affect professional aspirations, as we just saw in the previous slide, and then produce more guarded ways when interacting with members from the different group. Okay. So sources of stereotype threat in the clinical setting, these can result from salient clues in the environment, suggesting somehow that minority patients are unintelligent, unworthy of good care, or second-class citizens. This can be the person, the receptionist, giving that impression to materials or pictures of only white people in a waiting room, or, I mean, there might be all different potential sources of cues that signal to a patient that somehow minorities are not worthy there, or might be considered second-class citizens. So the sources are any kind of experienced discrimination and disrespectful treatment within healthcare. And so I tell you, anybody working in that office can put off a cue that somehow minorities are not desirable there. And again, a lot has to do with perception, but a lot has to do, those perceptions often result from direct experience with discrimination and disrespectful behavior. Okay. It might also come across another source of the healthcare providers themselves, who might be experiencing conscious or unconscious negative stereotypes of racial, ethnic minority patients. Okay, and so that is something that physicians or healthcare providers really need to explore and evaluate and educate themselves, so that they can make sure that they are not being the cue indicating a cue of stereotype threat. That's what I meant. Oops. Sorry. Let me see. I jumped ahead. Okay. So consequences of stereotype threat, they listed 6 in the article. One was treatment adherence, right? So other than, the person may be disengaging from the situation because they don't like the way they feel. If they experience stereotype threat, again, it's going to lead to a stress response. And one of the stress responses is cognitive capacity, right? It affects the way we think. Think of when you've been really stressful and how you think, like, I can't think straight, right? Or it affects your short-term memory, right? So that reduced cognitive capacity in a medical interaction with a physician can reduce one's ability to hear and process the information the doctor is saying, and even to follow the instructions that are being conveyed to them, right? It's like if you're too anxious in the moment, you're not going to be able to process the medical recommendation or the treatment instructions. It can affect communication. So when we're really anxious, we might become really self-conscious about the way we're communicating. Do I sound dumb by asking questions? And so people might be less willing to disclose any problems they may be experiencing, or if the doctor asks a question, they might not be very effective in responding. If one experiences a stereotype threat, it might also lead them to discount any feedback that the doctor is providing. So if the doctor was the cue that triggered the stereotype threat, then the individual might feel like, I'm not taking any advice from you. It's like, I don't trust what you're telling me, right? And you might discount the validity of the information or recommendations that are being provided to you. And so you might dismiss them altogether. Disengagement is another consequence of stereotype threat, such that if you experience and are triggered to experience a stereotype threat, that's not a pleasant experience. And we like to avoid unpleasant experiences, right? So if the last time I went to my doctor, I experienced something like that, the likelihood I'm going to come back is very low, right? So I'm going to disengage from future medical encounters with that physician. Disidentification is another one, and I think we talked about it in the previous slides already. But it's basically you stop identifying with the threatening situation or the individual providing the recommendations. And if you perceive the doctor as being different, as being other than your self-identity, you're less likely to adhere to their recommendations. And then they talked about a sixth one. A sixth consequence is the reinforcement of stereotypes in the clinical setting, such that if somebody experiences a stereotype threat, they might, default into behaving in those stereotype ways. And because they default into those stereotype ways, then that just might reinforce the stereotype for the practitioner, for the healthcare provider. And so it's just a vicious cycle. And this last one's really unfortunate because these reinforced stereotypes will cause the doctors to make, clinical decisions that contribute to racial and ethnic disparities. So because the doctor doesn't think the patient's going to comply with treatment, they might recommend another type of treatment that's easier to follow and comply with, even though it's not the optimal treatment. And so that's really unfortunate. Okay, they talked about some strategies for reducing stereotype threats. And one of these was to elicit the patient's values and strengths and their strengths. So have them focus on in self-affirming strategies, right? It's like just let them highlight, in what areas they're good, so that you can work with them to engage them in a medical strategy that will benefit them and that they'll be more likely to engage in. Okay. The doctor should set high standards and also convey the confidence that the patient can follow through with those high standards of treatment recommendations, right, of behavioral expectations. So the recommendation might be to engage in physical activity, but the doctor can convey that they have confidence that the patient can carry out these recommendations that they are putting forth. Number 3, list external attributions for the patient's anxiety and difficulties. So if the patient feels like, I'm very anxious, I don't know if I can follow through with the recommendations you're making, the physician or the provider should work with them to let them know that this is common. This kind of anxiety is common, that most patients have it. Don't worry. I'm sure you can do it. Again, help impose that confidence in the patient that they can carry out the behavior. And then also you can engage the patient in in troubleshooting, right? So help them identify the barriers if they're anxious, but those are outside barriers that we can work on a solution to help overcome, right? Provide cues that diversity is valued. So avoid being colorblind, right? That, oh, we're colorblind here. Like, no. Instead, make sure that you recognize and value diversity, right? And then number 5 is another strategy for reducing stereotype threat is to have underrepresented minority providers in clinics and medical settings where there's a lot of underrepresented racial ethnic minorities as well. And so this helps to provide a safe environment for one's identity. So getting those minority providers, right, increasing the number of providers to serve in areas where there's lots of racial ethnic minority groups. There's also an impact of stereotype threat to getting underrepresented minorities into healthcare practice, because stereotype also impacts the academic performance of minorities, such that if one experiences stereotype threat in one's academic field, that can influence performance, as shown in many research studies, and also affects the ability of these individuals to graduate from college. When they graduate, it also affects their MCAT scores and other test scores needed to get into medical school. And then it also leads to lots of apprehension in clinical settings, like internships and such, and can lead to reduced performance evaluation. And so this stereotype threat is really damaging. And it's something that really needs to be addressed. That cultural competency training is really important for all these reasons, not only in the clinical setting, but even in trying to get more underrepresented minority providers in the clinical setting, right, to provide services in the clinical settings. And so they provide different strategies for, helping underrepresented minorities in the medical field. And then also they do talk about how those folks who are in academic settings, who are white, also experience the stress of being perceived as a racist, right? Because I'm white, I must be racist. And that also affects their performance as an instructor or as a mentor, because they don't want to come off as racist. And in their efforts not to appear as racist, it leads to very clumsy, awkward interactions, right? And not always the best type of mentoring. So I think part of it is for everyone to engage in cultural competency training to help overcome that fear of coming off as racist, and also in learning to appreciate, right, the different racial ethnic minority groups and their cultural views, their world views. So lots more research needed in this area. And that's one of the big goals for us to reach by 2030, right? To increase research in this area, to increase the number of evidence-based interventions available, so that we can be disseminating those more widely and making sure people are getting the appropriate training, as opposed to a tiny lecture throughout their academic training, right, in this particular area. Okay, I think that was the last one on this PowerPoint. And so I hope you have a good night, and I hope things turn out well in our presidential election. And I guess we'll touch base on that at next week's lecture. In the meantime, I hope you all are staying well and safe and in a happy place. Okay.